Hello, class. This video will go over Chapter 8, which talks about the various types of alternative news leads. So, on Monday's module, we talked about basic news leads, and you'll remember that a lead refers to the central point of the story. It most often provides a summary of the 5 W's and an H, giving the reader an understanding of what's coming up. However, sometimes those can be very boring. As your textbook talks about, a lot of times a basic news lead doesn't capture the audience's attention. And so alternative leads allow you to get more creative, to have a different perspective on your story. Alternative leads are also known as soft leads. They tend to be multiple paragraphs, which kind of breaks the rule of that simple, concise writing that we typically need for leads. And it still focuses on the most interesting details. However, it does so through elements of storytelling and painting a picture with your words. A lot of times, alternative leads require a lot of thought, imagination, and creativity, so they can be very difficult to execute. You have to be a very skilled writer in order to write an alternative lead, and you need to take time to focus on the creativity and really building that story. And as always, your leads need to be clear, concise, accurate, and interesting, because without that, then they're not really leads. Here's an example. A 10-year-old altar girl was killed by stray bullets outside her Bronx church yesterday after a gang of armed street thugs crashed a christening party and began arguing with guests. That is a basic lead. It gives you the primary facts of the story. The audience really knows what's going on without having to delve further into the story. However, the New York Daily News wrote this alternative lead for the same story. Little Melanie Mendez went to church to celebrate a new life, but instead she lost her own. So which one for you as a reader or listener at this point makes you want to continue reading further? The idea behind an alternative news lead is that it really captures the audience's attention and really forces them to continue reading so that they get more of the information behind what has interested them. Now, there's a lot of criticism behind soft news leads. The Wall Street Journal was actually the first to use soft leads within the national newspaper daily spectrum. But a lot more journalists are given freedom to write alternative leads now, especially in the age of digital communication, where a lot of online publication really requires you to capture your reader's attention quickly and interestingly. The criticism of alternative leads is that they follow a more literary style. It's called jello journalism because you can't really get a firm grasp on what's going on just by reading the alternative news leads. Another criticism is that alternative news leads, when written by people who are not great writers, tend to fall flat. They create more confusion, and you often lose your reader because they don't know what's going on. So if you lack the ability to write an alternative news lead, don't include it in your story. You need to be able to master a basic news lead before you attempt to do an alternative news lead for your publication. There are many different types of alternative news leads. The first is a buried or delayed lead. You'll remember from your basic news leads video that buried leads are not looked upon highly, which is why it's really hard to advocate for a buried or delayed news lead in your writing. Now, feature stories tend to be the ones that use buried leads the most. So you're providing an interesting example or story, and then your nut graph will state the central point a lot later. So here we have a video about how Keith Richards is spending his time during quarantine. The anecdote or story that Keith Richards tells about releasing a YouTube video that has 10 million views is meant to exemplify how stars are living during the COVID-19 quarantines. And so this is arguably a good buried or delayed lead because you get this anecdotal story that creates interest for the reader so that they can continue reading on. Now, a multi-paragraph lead also uses an interesting example or story, but the summary is really broken into 2 or 3 paragraphs that are meant to flow as one. So this story is about a protest about opening a certain canyon to all-terrain vehicles. And so it paints a picture about what the ATVs do, why they had to be closed, and the message is clear, right? So it provides a lot of information within these 2 or 3 paragraphs, but they're really meant to be a single lead. Now, quotes don't usually get used as leads because they don't summarize the way that we need to. So remember, a lead is meant to really capture the primary information. In fact, a lot of newsrooms will not allow a quotation to begin a story because it's really the reporter's job to provide that summary of information to the reader or viewer or listener so that then the sources can provide kind of further evidence of what that reporter is saying, or to really create an opinion or emotion from the piece. However, sometimes we get quotes that are so effective that we can't really improve them. And so then we would want to use the direct words of the source rather than creating our own. So here's an example from Fox 6 in Birmingham. One of Alabama's most powerful lawmakers said that he made a poor choice of words when he said he wanted to see more people infected with COVID-19 to start reaching an immunity. So this was about an Alabama senator who was talking about herd immunity early on in the COVID-19 outbreak. And so they want to directly quote him here, not only to kind of protect themselves and attribute his words, but show what he actually said. Now, I think it could have been done a little bit more effectively than kind of summarizing and using quotes. Instead, I think they should have used his direct quote to lead it off and then summarize. But again, that's really rare. In fact, I know Fox 6 has some protocols about using quotes as leads. So you want to use this sparingly. Question leads are those that ask questions in order to introduce the topic of the story. But again, these are often not used because a lot of journalists believe they should answer questions, not ask them. And a lot of times questions run the risk of being cliche. And so we should try to avoid that as much as possible. So here, your textbook provides an example from the Patriot News that not only asks the questions, but then directly answers them. Fill out college application? Check. Take the SATs? Check. Have 3 or 4 college courses already under your belt? For students hoping to get accepted at higher end colleges, taking a few AP courses is no longer a nice add-on to college resumes, it's the norm. So here you're providing your reader kind of like a checklist, you know, thinking about things that you would have to do to apply to college. So it can get them immediately interested. However, it's very obviously being used as a device for attention because the journalist is answering the question directly after providing the question. Suspenseful leads are those that create interest in the story by leaving off information in the first few sentences that will be answered later. So in this story, this man is unhappy. His unhappiness stems not from a lack of skills, but from his heritage. So if you're reading this, you're like, do what? And that's kind of the hope for a suspenseful lead, that an audience member goes, what? You know, and kind of gets interested because they're on the edge of their seat to find out what happens. And so this gentleman was refused a government job because his father was convicted on embezzlement. And so it moves forward from there. So you can see that we're kind of creating that cliffhanger for the audience to hook into. Descriptive leads paint a picture before moving into the action. This New York Times story is about the popularity of dogs on Instagram. And so instead of using this final paragraph as the lead, which is really kind of the nut graph in this example, they talk about Tuna, who is apparently a very famous Instagram star, had no idea. But they kind of describe Tuna's life, why he's perfect for Instagram. They compare him to a Kardashian and things like that. So it really creates this vivid imagery of good old Tuna so that we can then hook into why dogs on social media matters. Twist leads and irony leads are those that are meant to shock the reader and grab the attention of the reader. The danger here is sensationalism or exaggeration, and so we really have to avoid that. The Philadelphia Inquirer writes, "Soon it will be spring again. The snow will melt, the dogwoods flower, trumpets will blast, graves will open, and the earth will begin a 5-month descent into its fiery end." So here we're talking about this radio evangelist who predicted the end of the world and doing it by twisting the information where you think you're starting out one way, but then you have this twist that, spring will turn into, the end of times. So this is probably effective. However, think about if you're reading pretty quickly and you just start on the first 2 sentences, are you going to continue reading? So the danger is that you might lose some of your audience by providing a twist because it doesn't quickly grab the attention before the twist. Direct address leads speak directly to the reader. So typically this is going to be addressed such as you or your, but you can run the risk of alienating if whatever you're directly addressing your audience about doesn't apply to them. And so if you're like, "Hey, are you having trouble finding a bra?" and you're a male reader, you're probably not going to continue reading, right? So you have to be very careful in the ways that you speak directly to readers. So here's an example that I found about pesticides. Sinking your teeth into a crisp apple or chomping on a stalk of celery is something you should be able to do without thinking. So you can see the direct address with you and your. After all, the best nutritional science shows that eating a variety of fruits and vegetables, and plenty of them, is a crucial component of good health. But produce sometimes comes with potentially harmful pesticide levels. So what is the story really about? It's about harmful pesticide levels. So it does take us a while to get to the real main idea of the story. However, they're trying to create a direct address to show that this matters to you and your health. So the things to remember with alternative leads is that the lead, no matter how it is written, has to be newsworthy. It needs to capture the elements of the 5 W's and an H, and it really should still follow kind of the main point idea, regardless of how you're writing it. With alternative leads, you have to grab attention and you need to do it early, which means that your lead has to be well written and creative. Often this makes alternative leads a lot harder to write than a basic lead. And you can only use alternative leads with the right style of story. You don't want to talk about, a homicide that's awful and gruesome and then try to use a catchy, clever lead because it's inappropriate. You also want to vary your use. So if you are just known as the alternative question writer, your audience will start getting bored with it. And so you want to vary the amount that you use alternative leads, and often you want to use them sparingly. When you have the right story, when you have the right creative idea, then you can use them. But a lot of times you're going to be fighting with your editors, producers, and others within your newsroom because they're not widely accepted even now. So be thinking about that as you're writing alternative leads, and use the reporter's guide to writing alternative leads as kind of a checklist to know what's appropriate and what's not. So now that you've learned a little bit more about alternative leads, know that you will not have a discussion post this week. I will leave just a place where you can leave questions in case you have a question about this week's assignment or anything about alternative news leads, but know that it's not required. Instead, I want you to focus on your homework because, as we've talked about, alternative leads take time and thought to write about. So you're going to go into your workbook, go into chapter 8, exercise 2, and write alternative leads for examples 1 through 6. Then for your AP style section today, we're going to be learning about possessives and apostrophes.